immigration is certainly one aspect of this mode of governance which the world over has been applied, at least in the Western world. And polling in the UK has said that immigration has now shot up to be the top concern amongst British voters. Again, this always happens in a bit of a lag. It lags behind when immigration shoots up because it takes a while for people to see the effects. But obviously, the news cycle is quite relentless at the moment, and even in attempts to try to dampen any potential rhetoric or diffuse the situation by not drawing attention to certain characteristics, referring to people as a man has stabbed X, for example. We've had lots of that recently. I think there is a palpable sense of fear in the country. So immigration, top concern. And what I've noticed is that there seems to be in the last few weeks an Overton window shift, which not on talking or criticizing immigration. That's been around for the best part of a year and a bit. But in mainstream publications, we've seen people like Isabel Oakeshott start talking about how Britain, this is a quote, Britain needs a shock and awe campaign of mass deportations to tackle the illegal migrant crisis. We've had Douglas Murray and Jordan Peterson. Now, Douglas has criticised immigration policy for years, but he spoke about integration. He said, we've always had this goal of integration, and he starts pointing to the history of Britain, about being different ethnic groups of British people. Said, it's not clear to me whether we've managed to integrate people into that, because how do you do so? Douglas Carswell, a former UKIP politician who now spends his time between the US and UK, released some statistics of British Muslims being asked, 16 to 24 years old, being asked whether people who convert to other faiths ought to receive the death penalty, or should it be punishable by death. 36% agreed. And he said, this ought to be a proxy for stripping people of their citizenship and deportation. This is not me necessarily saying that's something that can actually happen, but interesting that people are coming out saying this stuff, and it's going to mainstream publications, and you can find people who were once part of the Conservative Party jumping behind these and agreeing with it, or reposting Conor Tomlinson's articles saying, immigration debate's over. It just really isn't doing us any good, and anyone who tells you it is lying. So the other window might not be shifting for everyone. We have Keir Starmer delivering speeches and never mentioning immigration. What actions do you think the public would deem acceptable to get immigration illegal and legal under control within a bounds of acceptability for the British people?
The Overton window is shifting massively. That's right to say. Again, I will bring it back to this thing of people just getting sick and tired of being called names when they talk about this topic, whether it's racist or, whatever else. We're at a point now, as you say, where we've had in the Telegraph, somebody, Isabel Oakeshott, calling for mass deportations. Now, when you say the phrase mass deportation to the average person, their mind immediately goes to like mid-century Germany. But actually, I put out a tweet yesterday saying deportation should not be a dirty word. And it's actually the policy of any self-respecting and secure nation, because it's just simply the most effective solution to removing foreign criminal elements from your society. There's no reason that there are foreign criminals in our prisons, for example. I mean, we're hearing Keir Starmer talking about how full our prisons are and how he's going to release, about 20,000 prisoners, partly in order to make room for people that were arrested during the riots, which is a very dark thing in and of itself. But these are foreign people, foreign criminals who have no business being in Britain, who are being put up by the taxpayer in prisons at our expense. And so deporting those people should just be a matter of course. It should just be, something that's not even talked about. It's just the obvious solution. And yet we've got to this position because of various activist groups, NGOs, lawyers, and so on, that even broaching the notion of deportation is somehow considered evil. You're immediately in talk of human rights and all the rest of it. But actually, it doesn't have to be, people think that it's somehow like a violent thing. It doesn't have to be a violent thing at all. I mean, of course, if foreign criminals start resisting the deportation measures, then obviously there's going to be a need for a certain amount of force. But actually, these are criminals that we're talking about, right? They're not exactly, they're not like kids or innocent people. So it's absolutely appropriate that the conversation shift now to a more serious register when we're talking about deportation, because it is necessary. I mean, there's literally no other solution to some of the problems that we're facing other than that. I mean, again, to bring it back to illegal immigration, which is a very important but very, very different issue to legal immigration. People sort of conflate the two because they sort of sound, obviously they're both about migration, but it's fundamentally different. When it comes to illegal immigration, there should not be a question of deporting people. If you come to the country illegally, you have no business being here and you will be removed. It should be that simple. And again, any self-respecting nation has that policy. But again, we're at a point now where our political class are so atrophied and so kind of stultified that they can't actually achieve any of these things because there's just, the will just doesn't exist. The actual machinery of the managerial state in the civil service is institutionally left-wing and progressive. And so they can't broach any idea, any sort of notion of this kind of thing. Which is why, again, I'll bring it back to this, which is why a new political class is necessary. New leaders need to step forward and emerge in order for this to happen. And I have absolutely no doubt that that is going to happen. I think that what people like me and Connor represent is inevitable. I think that the young people in Britain, most of whom are under ordinary times would be apolitical, they're seeing what's being done to their country. And they're thinking, actually, I do actually love this country. It's my country. I grew up here. All of my friends are from here. And I'm watching these people who are in positions of power doing things that are actively damaging not just my local community, but the country at large. And so there's going to be a far greater appetite and a far greater level of kind of acceptance of things like deportation as things go forward. And I think that's a good thing. It's not a pleasant thing. I think it's terrible that we've found ourselves in this kind of situation as a nation, but it's simply the reality of the situation. And if the options are get called racist and do deportations of criminals, or get called racist and don't, and watch the country become more dangerous for women and children, more unstable, more financially worse off, then I pick the former every time.
Well, I was going to ask about the prospects of regaining control, but you've already pointed to how institutional bias will mean that it's going to be hard to do so under the current form of governance which we have. However, you've nodded to this rising counter-elite, as it were. Have you read Peter Turchin's book End Times, by any chance?
I'm familiar. I haven't read it. I'm familiar with Peter Turchin, though.
Yeah, so his research, having looked at, about 1,000 years of history, perhaps even more, looking at all of these times where there ended up being political disintegration within nations and within empires, it came about as elites became distant from and started to disregard the needs of those that they govern. And the time that things are more harmonious are when they're closer to them, they're closer to their needs, they govern not just in their interests, but they are actually able to be held accountable. And when they grow distant, conflict rises inexorably until such point as either reform happens, so they save it before things get really bad, or counter-elites displace them. And there are many different ways which that happens. And some of them we've talked about how we don't want to happen, but it can happen in a violent and bloody revolution. It can happen in civil war, or it can happen through the means which we've developed over time within the Western world, a democratic handover. And so you've said you're confident you can see a rise in people who would be willing to take the reins and do something different. Where are these counter-elites rising from to challenge the status quo? Do you see it, besides you and people within your political milieu? Do you see institutions being set up that are going to be pushing against the grain we've been moving in for so long?
The battle that we face is pretty daunting. The power structure that we are up against is absolutely almost incomprehensibly complex and large, because we're not just talking about the government here. This is the problem. People need to understand that when we talk about the regime that governs us, it's not as simple as it just being, parliament. It's not nowhere near that simple. There has been a blurring of the lines between all of the various centers of power in our society, whether it's, again, it's the ones I've listed before, between the government, the NGOs, the civil service, the corporations, the media, the education institutions. These things all mass together to form this absolutely towering structure. And it's that in its totality that we are up against. So that's a daunting prospect. But again, every single day I am so heartened by the types of people who are drawn to the politics that I am myself drawn to. It's almost exclusively fit, young, attractive, normal, relatable, intelligent, driven, ambitious young people. And that's because it's only those people who are capable of actually righting this ship. Because, again, my parents' generation, quite frankly, they're already checked out. They have their lives, they have their jobs. They don't want to upset, their own lives because they've got families to worry about and mortgages to pay off. I don't expect, people of that kind of generation to be the place where the change comes from. And so ultimately it has to be us. And I am, as I say, I'm so confident, and it's lit up and down the country. From every area of the country, there are these young people emerging who have this, it's just this quality that I don't think we've seen for a very long time in mainstream British politics. And it is just this uncompromising integrity, sincerity, commitment, and authenticity to Britain. It's out of a sense of love of this country and love of the people around them and love of family, love of history and love of tradition, that they're coming out, and they feel as though they have to. That's the thing. I mean, that's how I think of myself. I can't bring myself to do anything else other than be involved in politics. And I'm not hugely pleased about that fact, because when I was at university, my plan was to go and join the army, but unfortunately they wouldn't let me in, because I never wanted to be the type of person that went straight from education into politics. But actually I found myself in a situation where I cannot, morally, I can't bring myself to do anything else, because I think that the hour is so dark, and we live in this time that demands that people who are prepared to do so step forward and step up, that I have to. And there are dozens, maybe hundreds of other people similar to myself who are going through the same kind of thing. And I think that's amazing. I think it's beautiful. And that's why I say that we are inevitable.
I think there's probably a reason that the Overton window is shifting too, because I think a lot of the people that you're referring to, and I've certainly spotted a lot online, is that, well, you're the online generation as well, and you know how to create content, for want of a better word, and it's slick. You're not afraid to produce videos of yourself, get messaging out. You can fit a lot of information in hardly any time, not afraid to go on talk shows. And that's something I've certainly been struck by in the last couple of years, is seeing the likes of you, Connor, Harrison Pitt, a whole bunch of others who wouldn't necessarily say they're part of the same ballpark, but people like Freya India, people who are going against this perceived wisdom on a whole bunch of different issues, or very countercultural, as you say, even though people would accuse you of being somehow establishment shills, no doubt. And I suppose the question is there a political vehicle for you? We've got Reform marching ahead in the polls. Are they going to be capable of doing the job required on immigration? And will we see an opening up, a democratizing of reform, so it's less a Nigel Farage pet project, and it's opened up for it to become a proper political party? And is that something that you think younger people can be attracted to?
So what I'll say first is the people that I'm talking about here, we are people who would, under ordinary circumstances, be conservatives. We'd call ourselves conservatives. We'd say we have conservative values. But I don't call myself a conservative anymore. I used to, but I think I look around, especially institutionally speaking, what is left of value to conserve? Conservatism is the wrong mode to be thinking in, because there's an inertness to conservatism. There's a sense that you're just, the march of history is inevitable, and that, we're clinging on to these old values that we wish would come back, but actually, progress is progress and all the rest of it. No. What I think is there is no going back. There is no such thing as returning to this, that, or the other. There is only going forward. The question is which direction. And the direction that I favor is unrecognizably different to the one that the current power structure is heading in. At a certain level, the kind of world that I'm imagining that I would like to live in, at one level, it's very, very similar to the one that we live in now. People would still drive cars and people would still have computers and so on. But at almost every other level, it would be completely different. because there'd be a different sense, again, a different sense of identity, community, culture, tradition, and all the rest of it. And so the question of what the most effective vehicle for this will be, I do actually have faith in Reform. I think Reform UK is the best vehicle we have for bringing these kinds of politics into the mainstream and beginning to affect the kind of change that we want to see. I think Nigel Farage recognizes this. I think he knows that what he is part of is bigger than him. This is a movement that, if done right, and if the right people are brought in and are allowed to have the kind of authority they would need, would be basically unstoppable. Because Reform already have Gen Z's curiosity. There was more Gen Z voters voted for Reform than they did the Tory party. What they need to do now is capture their attention. And I think there's a number of ways they can do that. One way they could do that is by establishing a youth wing. Another is by showing young voters why specifically their policies benefit them. But there's a number of things that need to be done there. But I just bring it. I have this undying optimism that things will not last in the way that they're currently going. And I think that, again, the caliber of person that is drawn to right-wing dissident politics is so much higher than the type of person who is drawn to mainstream regime-approved politics. And that's inevitably the case because it requires a certain quality, a certain level of panache to put yourself out there in a dissident fashion. And so it's unsurprising that the people drawn to it are high caliber. So again, I would just bring it back to those people who say it's over, who say that Britain is done for and that there's no going back. I say to those people, where is your spine? I say to those people, stand up like a man. You're an Englishman. Start acting like it. And I think that what's coming cannot be stopped.
Well, that's almost a perfect note to finish on. But we're not going to finish there, Charlie, because looking forwards then, which is where you're saying we can only go forward, is people have often said that the victors write history. So depending on who it is that's coming to write history, and they look back on this period, say the last 30 years, or arguably the period since the Second World War, and the modes of governance which have become the typical ways of doing business amongst Western governments, what do you think people will say about this period in history? How will it be judged? How will the leaders be judged?
I think this is a really useful way to think about any era, is to imagine in 200 years' time how our descendants will be taught what this period was like. Personally, I think that this period will be remembered and taught and written about as being the era in which Europe completely lost its mind. I think that the context of the Second World War is crucially important. I think that we're still living in the aftermath of World War II, and that's how this will be remembered, is we're still in the post-World War II era, because, what Michel Foucault would call the regime of truth that we've lived in for the last 80 years is completely informed by the events of World War II. And once we can finally get free of that and get free of the scars that war inflicted on Europe, only then will we be able to see that some of the stuff that's happened over the last 80 years in every area of life, whether it's, immigration is what we've been talking about today, but there's also the various things around, you mentioned earlier, the sexual revolution, for example. All of these things will be looked at as being a period of madness, a period of insanity in Europe. And day to day, we all live our lives, we go to work, we sit down with our families, and all the rest of it, we play some sports. It feels normal, but actually in the long view of history, when only the key details remain and the day-to-day is, cast aside, we're living through a period of madness. And that's how I believe this period will be reported, because as I've said already, I have no doubt that we will win and that we will therefore be the ones to write the history. And I think that right-thinking people who recognize the objective reality of things like morality and beauty, the unchanging element of human nature and all of these things, will look at this period as being an absolutely unprecedented blip in human history, where we just completely lost touch with every aspect of reality. We decided to declare war on nature, in a sense, by rejecting nature, rejecting morality, embracing relativism, embracing universalism. And what this led to was destruction of an unprecedented type across Europe. But as I say, this will be reported from a position of having returned to the historical norm. And I said before that I don't really believe in the idea of returning to anything, and I do believe that's true. But I do think there have been periods in history where we've been closer to that kind of objective, perennial world than we are now. I think returning to that is important. So yeah, I think this period of history will be remembered as being completely insane. And I think those of us who can realize that as we are living through this moment will be the ones who essentially spearhead the movement out of it.
As you were talking there, I couldn't help but Google some Rudyard Kipling poem lyrics. And he seems to have a poem which is fit for almost every day.
Is it the Gods of the Copybook Headings?
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's exactly what you were talking of there, this return to the norm. And I'll just open with the first verse here, because I think it speaks to what you're talking about. As I pass through my incarnations in every age and race, I make my proper prostrations to the gods of the marketplace. Peering through reverent fingers, I watch them flourish and fall, and the gods of the copybook headings, I notice outlast them all. And, there are about 7 or 8 verses, and effectively it goes on to talk about how human folly is to keep getting caught up in these abstractions, these utopian ideals that if only you could plan perfectly, if only things were going to turn out in the best case scenario, then everything would be fine. But every time your delusions are availed by the things which we have done so well to throw on the scrap heap, like, for example, the copybook headings people used to write out at school, which is various things that were in the Proverbs or in Psalms or, biblical teachings or whatever else from ancient wisdom, the ancient Greek philosophers. So really interesting that you talk about that. And it's something I meditate on quite a lot when I, working in the corporate world, see people get really worked up worked up in excitement about this new thing. And every time it fizzles out because it's never what they thought it was. And it's always counter to reality. I'm going to let you go in a second, Charlie. But before I do, I know you're a young man and you may not have had any of these big U-turns, these moments where you think, that's just shaking everything. But perhaps you have. Maybe you haven't always thought the way you have. What I like to ask my guests is there anything that you were once pretty certain of in life that you changed your mind about? And what was it that made you change your mind?
That's a really good question. That is a really good question. You have to give me a second to think about it, just for a moment.
Please do.
Do you know what it is? So one of the biggest, I think, is going from studying politics in an academic setting into working in politics as I do, showed me that politics is almost nothing to do with ideas and everything to do with people. And that concept extends well beyond politics, and that actually applies in every area of life. What's important is people, and ideas are kind of after the fact. Because what I would say in the political context is if you have good ideas, but bad leaders, bad people, then you'll get nowhere. But if you have bad ideas, but good leaders and good people, then the ideas tend to catch up. And this is why I'm so heartened. And this is why I keep harping on this point of the caliber of person that is drawn to kind of right-wing dissident politics. The ideas are there, of course, but it's their personal qualities, their personal drive, competence, commitment, sincerity, authenticity, and so on. That's what I'm so heartened by. And so, being in that kind of academic context, it's easy to think that the only thing that matters is ideas, and that the history of the world is the history of the battle of ideas and the marketplace of ideas and all the rest of it, when actually it isn't. People are what are important. And I would say that that's a truth for every area of life.
Charlie Downs, thanks so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm looking forward to seeing what you get involved in as the years roll on, and hope to have you back on Thinking Class at some point.
Thanks very much, John. It's been great.
Thanks, Charlie. Take care. To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel at Thinking Class and follow me on X at Thinking Classes. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.